Good morning, everyone. Today I'll be talking about visual recognition across modalities with limited supervision. Our current visual recognition models are really good at specific tasks. So, given the right kind of supervision, the right modality, we can actually solve a bunch of these tasks to a very high degree of accuracy. For example, consider the task of object detection and segmentation. If I were to give you the exact right labels and if I were to give you the exact right taxonomy, we can train a detector for a particular domain and try to solve this problem with a pretty high degree of accuracy. The same goes for a bunch of these tasks like short video understanding and image and text tasks. In summary, our current visual recognition models are really good specialists when we train them for each task and modality. However, they're not generalists because they cannot be trained across different modalities or to solve different types of tasks. They really need to be trained for the exact task at hand. And this is primarily because of two reasons. The first one is that our machine learning models are extremely picky eaters. They're very modality specific. For example, we have a bunch of different architectures depending on the type of visual modality, even if it's the same concept that is present actually across all of these modalities. For example, we can have an image of a pineapple, a video of a pineapple, or a single view 3D capture of a pineapple. But to process all three of these things, we would actually use completely different architectures. And the second problem is that for a particular task, we need the exact right kind of supervision. A detection model, for example, cannot use a lot of supervision in the form of, say, image labels apart from pre-training. It cannot use that in any other way. And so what this means is that if I had to recognize a pineapple in 3D, I would need 3D supervision to be able to do that. And it does not matter if I had lots of videos or lots of images of that particular concept. So in this talk, I'll talk about our work in the past couple of years on trying to build general purpose vision models. And so I have three works representative in this line. The first one being Omnivore, which is a single model that works on images, videos, and 3D and sets state of the art on all three types of benchmarks. The second one, Mass2Former, is a single architecture that works on all types of pixel labeling tasks. So panoptic, instance, or semantic segmentation, and on both images and videos. And finally, we've trained a model called Detic, which is a detector that can use lots of image level labels to learn a very large vocabulary detector, for example, 20,000 classes or more, and it works across a variety of detection architectures. So in this talk, I'll really focus on Omnivore and Detic, and for Mass2Former, I would refer you to my website for more details. So let's start with Omnivore. Omnivore is a single model for many visual modalities, and it was done with these collaborators at FAIR. Now, visual perception is naturally multimodal. So for a particular concept like pineapple, we can observe it in terms of its images, or we can observe videos of pineapples, which tells us how people can interact with a particular pineapple. Or we can also get single view 3D captures of pineapples, in which case we understand how pineapple's shape is, how its texture is, and so on. And our goal in this work was to design a single model, a single omnivorous model that can take all these three types of modalities and basically learn a single shared representation. Now, why should such a model even be useful in practice? So the first reason is that this kind of model actually automatically enables cross-modal generalization. So remember the example I gave you about recognizing a pineapple in 3D if you had lots of images? Well, Omnivore can do that, and I'll actually show you results to that effect. The second is that it really saves us a lot of research and engineering effort. Now, in each of the cases, when we've made some advance in image recognition, we've had to duplicate that effort or duplicate the amount of engineering and research effort to make that same advance in video recognition. So here we have descriptors like SIFT and SURF and HOG. And the same thing, we basically discover very similar sort of descriptors for videos. So IDT. CNNs initially started gaining popularity for images, and then basically we found that similar architectures work for video. The same thing holds for even transformers for that matter. And finally, whenever a new visual modality becomes available, we would want that machine learning model to be able to use that. So for example, if you only had a single vision camera on a particular device, and suddenly if you were to give that device another camera, and now it basically acquires depth, you want the same ML model to be able to work across all of these different devices. So Omnivore is a single model that basically trains using images, videos, and single view 3D. And more importantly, it uses off-the-shelf datasets. So it does not need correspondences between these modalities to train. And I'll talk about what that means in practice later. Let's first look at how this particular model is trained. So at training time, we first decide which modality we are going to train on. So for example, in this case, let's say that we decided to pick video. So we pick a mini batch sampled from the video dataset, we tokenize it and project it, and we basically then process it with a single shared backbone, which is a transformer backbone. And then we have a modality specific head that classifies that particular video concept into one of its video classification classes. And this process is basically repeated for each of these modalities. So at training time, we'll sample each new modality and we'll basically use that particular modality's head to classify it. So what this means is that we don't really need the same exact observation to occur in all three datasets. We don't need this pineapple to be captured in all the videos as well as the 3D as well as images. And in fact, this model is not being trained in correspondence. So it's not really using the fact that the same pineapple occurs in the image or the video or 3D. In terms of model architecture, the architecture for this work is actually pretty simple. We use a transformer to process the patch embeddings, and we convert basically each of these input images or videos or the depth map into patches. We project them into embeddings, and then we use the same shared transformer backbone to process them. We use self-attention across either space or time depending on the modality, and that's how we sort of model the visual data. Our transformer backbone is based on the Swin transformer work coming out of Microsoft. For pre-training datasets, we use off-the-shelf datasets, ImageNet, Kinetics, and Sun. And like I said before, these datasets are not paired, so they don't have any correspondence across them. And in fact, these datasets have no semantic overlap also. So the classes in ImageNet, Kinetics, and Sun are actually fairly distinct. So in that way, basically, it's not the fact that we're seeing the same exact concept in any way across these three datasets. Now, despite sort of training this model without using corresponding data, we find something pretty amazing that occurs after training. So when we look at the shared representation and we sort of probe it and we conduct these nearest neighbor experiments, we find that this model can automatically share representations across modalities, even though it was never trained to do so. So for example, here on the left-hand side, I have an image of a pineapple. And now we compute its feature embedding using the Omnivore model. And we basically get an embedding. And we compute its nearest neighbors using embeddings computed from like different modalities. So when we look at its nearest neighbors in depth, we actually find depth maps of pineapples. When we look at its embeddings in single view 3D, we again find pineapples. And the same thing happens for video as well. We actually do get videos of pineapples. So what this means in practice is that if you had a pineapple classifier that you had trained for images, and you trained it using our Omnivore backbone, it would automatically recognize pineapples in video, single view 3D, and depth map without any training, or without even ever having seen a labeled example for any of these three modalities. And this sort of occurs for a bunch of these other concepts as well. We have quantitative evaluation of this in the paper. So you see that basically it's able to find the boat across videos, across depth maps. The same holds for like this Halloween pumpkin. Now, apart from these qualitative results, we benchmarked the Omnivore model quantitatively on a bunch of different state-of-the-art benchmarks. So the first benchmark we looked at was ImageNet for image classification, the second one being Kinetics for video classification, and the third one being Sun RGBD for depth classification. And in this case, we are showing you a gray model, which is a specific model trained for that exact modality. And in each case, these models are actually pre-trained on ImageNet and then fine-tuned on a particular dataset. So for example, the model for kinetics, the specific model, was actually pre-trained on ImageNet and then fine-tuned on kinetics. And the same holds for the model on Sun. It was first pre-trained on ImageNet and then fine-tuned on Sun. And Omnivore was trained using the combination of these three datasets, ImageNet, kinetics, and Sun. Now, despite using roughly the same amount of supervision, what we find is that the same exact model can actually outperform modality-specific models on all of these three benchmarks. So now we've basically reduced the number of parameters by a factor of 3 because we don't have 3 separate models. And we're getting an improved performance, especially on video, where you can see that the performance gain is more than 2 percentage points for this 400-way classification problem. We didn't even need to add in more supervised data to do this. We could use off-the-shelf data sets to achieve the same result. And another interesting property of Omnivore was that when we looked at how it sort of scales with different model sizes, it seems to suggest that higher capacity models are actually better and better for training omnivorous representations. So in this slide, we have 3 different architectures from left to right: Swin Tiny, Swin Small, and Swin Base. And as the architectures move towards the right, they increase in the number of parameters and hence the model capacity. And what we find is that when we have a specific model shown here in the gray line, we find that its accuracy is improving as you're scaling the model size. This is to be expected. But the accuracy gain for an omnivore model is actually much higher as you're improving the model capacity. In the paper, we also show a bunch of comparisons on a variety of different downstream tasks. So we have image tasks, we have video tasks, and we have single view 3D tasks. And we find that omnivorous representations set state of the art on all of these 3 different types of classification tasks. And in fact, even for like single view 3D segmentation tasks, Omnivore does set another state of the art on NYU. What we particularly found interesting was that for egocentric data, like epic kitchens, where you actually have a head-mounted camera of a user doing a particular activity, Omnivore provides a really significant gain on noun class recognition, presumably because images contain a lot of objects which are nouns, and hence the omnivorous model is actually able to recognize them very, very well for these downstream data sets that do have a lot of objects and users interacting with objects. And finally, like I said, we can take this model, we can train it on one modality and test it on another. And so what we did in this case is we take the Omnivore model and we basically give it different modalities at test time. So we either feed it RGB, we feed it either depth, or we feed it RGBD. And what we find is basically that in each case, it's actually able to produce pretty reasonable results. And it shows that this model can essentially accept whatever you give it at test time and still try to produce a reasonable answer. We have a follow-up work called OmniMAE that just came out in arXiv, which basically can be thought of as Omnivore meeting MAE, MAE being masked autoencoders, that work that came out of FAIR as well. So OmniMAE is a self-supervised model. It's a single model that is trained for images and videos. And what we find is that it can achieve state-of-the-art results on both image and video classification benchmarks. So it's the single model just fine-tuned on a bunch of these tasks. And we can train this model with a very, very high amount of masking. So 90% masking for image patches and 95% masking for video patches. And what we found is basically that this property seems to emerge a lot more when you have an omnivorous training setting. So if you had MAE when you applied it to just ImageNet, the authors of the original paper found that if they mask anything beyond 75% of the patches, they see a performance regression. However, in the case of OmniMAE, we find that we can actually mask up till 90% of the images. And because these transformer-based models like VIT, you only process the unmasked portion, this actually makes OmniMAE really, really fast to train. And we can train these models like VidHuge pretty easily on both video and image benchmarks jointly. So check this paper out and you'll find more results, and the code and model are out. This brings me to the second part of my talk, where I'll talk about Detic, which is a detector for 20,000 classes using image level supervision. And this work will actually be presented at ECCV on Thursday, on October 27th. So the key observation for this work was really that object detection can be split up into two sort of very separate problems. The first one being localization, where you are trying to find out objects. And the second one being naming, where you're trying to name objects that you found in the first stage. Now, traditional detectors such as mask-RCNN, DETER, YOLO, they really couple both of these sub-problems. And so they're trained basically with the same exact supervision for both problems. So you need bounding boxes and names on a very large dataset to be able to train them. So you essentially need the localized box to be able to predict basically where objects are, and you learn naming in the same exact step. This is a huge problem because now we need to collect datasets with both of these properties when we're trying to train these models. And if you look at the number of classes that you get by collecting these datasets, it's actually really small. So Coco to a dataset like Elvis, we get about roughly 1,000 classes. Whereas ImageNet, which is actually a decade old at this point, has 21,000 classes, which shows us that it's much easier to collect image level data, especially when we're trying to get a large coverage in terms of number of classes. The second problem is that these datasets, especially the object detection datasets, have a really, really long and heavy tail. So Elvis, for example, in this case, you get a lot of these classes and most of these classes where you get very, very small number of images. The same long tail exists in image datasets, but you actually get, in absolute terms, you get a higher number of images just because these datasets, image level datasets, are much larger. So for ImageNet, you'll actually get for each of these classes in Elvis where you have basically less than 500 images, ImageNet will give you more than 1,000 images for each of these. And so what are these rare classes? Are we really talking about extremely rare looking exotic species of animals and plants? It doesn't seem to be the case. So we ran a very simple experiment where we took a detector, state-of-the-art detector trained on Elvis, and we ran it on a bunch of images, which I thought should have been pretty simple to recognize. This is a lion. And what we find, unfortunately, is that this Elvis detector actually thinks that the lion is either a dog, or it's a bear, or it's a cow in some cases. And this is not surprising given the amount of images that basically these detection datasets contain. Coco has 0 concepts of lion. Elvis has 43. So should we collect more images of lion and annotate them? It doesn't seem to be necessary. ImageNet has basically more than 1,000 images of lions. So if we could somehow leverage this data from ImageNet to learn how to name this concept, because it does seem that this detector knows how to localize the object properly. So the bounding boxes themselves look correct. It's just the fact that naming seems to be a big problem. So our key idea in this work is to decouple localization and classification. So we'll first learn localization from detection level labels, and we learn the classification or the naming capabilities from image level labels. And so essentially, we can train our model with these two different types of datasets. We have a detection dataset like Elvis, which has a limited vocabulary, roughly about 1,000 classes. And we have a classification dataset, which has a very large vocabulary, 20,000 classes or more. And now we can train a detector using both of these datasets. And at test time, we can basically show that this detector will perform really well and it will recognize all of these classes, so 20,000 classes basically at test time. We also have another extension of Detic where we show that it can actually now do open vocabulary object detection. So you can type in the description of the object that you want to detect, and Detic goes and finds it in the image. So how do we set this problem up and how do we train this detector? So the first thing to note over here is that whenever you have detection level labels on a data, we know how to train these detectors. Mask RCNN is pretty well understood at this point. You can actually train it pretty well. But the main problem is, what do you do when you get an image level label? So you get this image and you get a single label here saying lion. What do you do then? You get a bunch of boxes from it, but which box is a lion? Well, we have a very, very simple solution. We say that you should just treat the entire image as a box and you just assign a label lion to that particular image and you now just backpropagate through the classification branch of the detector. So whenever we see any classification data, we don't train the detection branch or the localization branch. We only train the classification branch of the detector. Our second idea to make Detic open vocabulary is to replace these classifier weights using word embeddings. So in any detector, when we get these bunch of like bounding boxes, we then try to classify them into one of say 80 or one of say 1000 classes. And we learn these classifier weights online through backpropagation. In our case, we simply replace them by word embeddings, which are kept frozen. And so now the entire system is trained except the classifiers, which are kept frozen. What this allows us to do is that at test time, we can specify a new class just in terms of words, and now we can detect this new class completely in a zero-shot manner. So we took Detic and we evaluated it on Elvis, where we split up a bunch of classes into like base classes and rare classes. And we did not observe the rare classes for a bunch of our training. What we find is that Detic can work across these three different detection architectures, Mask RCNN, Sentinel-2, and deformable Detector. And in each case, adding Detic to a very strong baseline actually improves performance. And it seems to significantly improve performance for the rare classes, that long tail of Elvis classes that I had shown earlier. Detic is also really strong in terms of cross dataset evaluations. So we took Detic and we evaluated it on a bunch of these different datasets, Objects 365 and open images, and we evaluated it without fine-tuning. So this detector was just trained on a combination of Elvis and ImageNet 21K, and then we just evaluated to see whether it can even detect objects in these new datasets with different image statistics. And it turns out it can. So in blue, we have the strong baseline from the previous slide, which seems to already show some pretty good generalization, saying that modern detectors are doing pretty well. Now, when we add Detic on top of this, we find that we can get a pretty reasonable gain on Objects 365 and open images in terms of overall AP. So we get like a 9-point improvement on open images. And more significantly, what we find is that Detic's improvement is much larger for the rare categories. So when we look at Objects 365, the rare classes, we get a much larger improvement of 6%. And the same thing holds for open images, where we get a large improvement of 7% when we're detecting these rare classes. And we already have an online demo built by these awesome folks at Replicate who took Detic and just built this demo. You can play around with this model. And we have a bunch of like qualitative results just to show you how powerful this detector is. So in this case, we have like this really messy desk. It won the Messy Desk Award at Carnegie Mellon many years ago at this point. And we just ran this detector on top of this image. And what we find is that Detic is pretty good at localizing these really small objects. It has a pretty good vocabulary, and it seems to do a good job at finding these images. When we posted this work online, folks took this model and just ran it on a bunch of random images. Here's someone, presumably their breakfast, and it seems that Detic is doing a pretty good job here. It's producing boxes, it's producing masks for all of these objects. It seems to work pretty well on paintings as well. So here's the Last Supper painting, and you can see that it's actually found a bunch of these objects. It's actually demarcated them with masks. And on the right hand side, you can also see that there are a bunch of these masks and detections on cartoon images. So suggesting that it actually does work pretty well across a variety of different cases. So thanks so much. This is all from my side. Thank you.